Howdy folks, Troy with V-Twins the V8s coming back on to do another tutorial video using our 51 Ford supercharged pickup. And today what we're going to do is we're going to reseal a rear end. We've got a leaky pinion seal and where the housing mounts to the rear end housing, it is also leaking. So let's get at it. Alright, so here is our rear end housing. This is our yoke, and also this is our pinion housing here, and then the actual center section here where it bolts into the rear end. You can see somebody has attempted to seal this from the outside. We've got all this like RTV silicone across the bottom. That's all got to go. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this entire center section out. We're going to reseal the backside. We're going to take the yoke off. We're going to change the seal. We're going to change the seal in this housing and put some fresh fluid in it and get things operating as they should without any leaking. So to remove that center section, the axles have to be taken out of the rear end. Maybe not completely, but at least out of the spider gears in the rear end to allow that center section to come out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the tires. I'm going to pop the brakes off. We're going to remove the bolts that hold the axles on, and we're going to slide these axles right out and get ready to take out our center section. So let's go. Okay, so now I got my wheel off, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to unbolt my calipers, but I'm not going to disconnect the brake line. I'm not going to disconnect the emergency brake. I'm just going to hang these off over here, probably with a piece of mechanics wire or something, so I don't have to reset everything. Once I get those off, then I can slide my rotors off and take my bolts off of my axle. So now I've got my rotor off, I've got my caliper and pads off. I have my calipers hanging by a piece of mechanics wire, so I don't have to disconnect my emergency brake or break open my brake system so I don't have to rebleed. Now you can see my axle is here. If you look over here on the side, what you're going to see is these 4 bolts. Yes, they hold the caliper bracket, but they also hold a flange that holds the bearing and the seal for this axle. So we're going to take these bolts out, and then this axle will slide right out of the housing. So here's our axle setup. I removed the bolts. I removed the bracketry that holds the caliper. I took this, I removed this off the bolts here, that over on the side. All I have now is these bolts. I took all the nuts off. My axle is ready to, I'm going to tap this with a rubber mallet. This will pop off and slide right out. There's my axle right there on the floor. I pulled this out, and as you can see, there's a little bit of fluid right here. This is what you're seeing right here is the axle seal. Now, I would recommend replacing this axle seal just for safety. So because you don't want to have to take this back apart again for a leak. So I would recommend replacing those. But now we've got both of our axles out. I have the same scenario going on the other side. Thing right here. Here we go. So we're going to raise this up and remove that pumpkin. Okay, so now you can see this is my pumpkin here. I'm going to take all of these nuts off of these studs, and then this whole pumpkin is going to slide right out of the rear end. We can bring it over to the bench and do whatever we got to do to it. Okay, so at this point, I've removed my center section, and now I've cleaned my gasket surface. I ran a thread chaser over all these bolts. This thing had so much silicone, RTV, jammed up everywhere. I had to clean that all out. I took and wiped out this whole inside of the rear end housing so it's nice and clean. Now I got a gasket that I will adhere to here, and then my rear end housing, my center section will be ready to go back in. Okay, so meanwhile over here on the bench, I've got my center section here, and I've also cleaned the gasket surface on this side so it's all ready to go. Now I'm going to flip this over and do the disassembly so we can work on changing the seals and getting this thing tightened up. Okay, so here I am here on the bench. Get this thing stable, and I can just kind of walk my seal around, knock it off like this. And there it is. My seal's right off. Now I'm going to take these bolts here off, slide this housing out, and we can get that cleaned up. Okay, so I'm just going to zip all of these bolts off of this housing. And now this baby should come right out of here with a little bit of wiggling, a little bit of finesse, and boom. Now I got the whole piece right out. That's where my pinion support is, right there. I'm going to clean these gasket surfaces. We're going to replace this O-ring, and then we're going to replace the crush sleeve inside, and then we can reassemble. Okay, so now I've got my housing off. There's a shim that goes in between there. I've cleaned that. I've cleaned this mating surface here. Now I'm going to take and remove my outer pinion bearing and my housing. Just kind of set it down over here for right at this moment. Take another rag, wipe this housing down, and then if you can see here, there's a rubber O-ring that goes on this housing. That seals this housing to the center section, the chuck itself. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to go to all of our handy dandy new parts. That O-ring is in our kit. Okay, here we have this crush sleeve right here. This is crushed and it sets the bearing preload between the inner and the outer pinion bearings. That is also in this kit right here, along with a new seal that goes in the housing that we knocked off before. Matter of fact, you can match that up with this right here right now. Boom, that looks right. And then we've got a brand new nut and a brand new lock washer. My new parts match my old parts, so I can see that this looks identical to that. It's going to fit in this housing. I look at my yoke, make sure I don't have any extensive grooving going on here that's going to cause my seal not to seal. And yes, in fact, it does fit on there, and it fits on there snugly. That's great. Okay, so this is going to be good to go into here. Now, I want to make sure that my crush sleeve goes on there, and you'll notice that my crush sleeve is a little bit higher than the original. That is because this one's been crushed, this one hasn't. When we crush this, that's going to set our bearing preload, and that's what we're going to be going for right now. So I got my new crush sleeve on there, and I'm going to take and drop this together. So there we go. We got that one on there right there. We take our bearing. We can drop our bearing. It's giving me a hard time. There we go. Okay, so now my bearing is in there. Really nice. Okay, so now all that stuff's in there. I can go ahead and knock this seal on. Then my pinion yoke goes on. Then my washer and my lock nut. And then we work on crushing this sleeve. Okay, so I have my seal in here. I mean, if you have a seal driver that's deep enough to pop this on, that's great. If you got something that's relatively the same size to get it started, I used this piece of square tube and just tapped it ever so slightly to get it to go in squarely. And then I just went around the edge, tapping it lightly. All my seal all walked on and tapped down. I got my yoke. I'm going to put my yoke on. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a little bit of oil. Doesn't have to be any. This is just a little multi-purpose oil, just enough to lube that seal up. And then I can drop my yoke is down on here like it should be. I can go into my handy dandy little thing here. I'm going to put my nut on. And then this is where things get kind of interesting. So basically what happens is, as you tighten this nut, it's going to bring these together. And it's going to work like setting the preload in a wheel bearing. So as we tighten this, it's going to make the bearings tighter. The idea is the crush sleeve in between works as kind of an accordion. So as we turn this, we crush the sleeve, we get it to exactly where we want it, and it holds that pressure on the bearing and it holds the preload. So what I want to do is I want to get this supported. I'm going to get a wrench. I'm not going to use an impact or anything crazy like that. And I am going to turn this until I don't have any play in here. And then once I get to that point, Then we're going to check and see how much preload we have on this bearing. And what we want is about 12 inch-pounds, which isn't very much, but I got an inch-pound torque wrench, and I'll show you how we're going to do this. So in the meantime, I am just going to get this tightened. Okay, so I got my yoke supported in my vise. This is my housing. It moves back and forth, so I'm super loose. So to give you the brake rotor analogy, you're putting a set of rotors on your car, the old style, and you slide it on there, and then you screw the nut in, and then you've got your bearings loose, and you keep turning that nut until you don't have any play in there anymore. And that's what we're doing right now, is we're getting this screwed down to the point where those bearings are touching each other. Or not touching each other, they're coming into contact with the races, and we don't have any play over here on this side. Now I got a ways to go here. This doesn't take a lot of tension to get there. Okay, so now I can feel I'm up against that sleeve, but I still have a lot of play. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the other camera so you can look down on this and see exactly what I'm doing. I'm up against my crush sleeve now, and I have this play. So I need to continue to turn this to start to crush that sleeve, but I want to do this slowly until I don't have any play. So this does take some force. I'm going to turn this a little bit so I can do this like this. Still got quite a bit of play. Yep. Still got some play. So I'm just going to keep turning this until I get it to the point where I don't have any play. Okay, so now I'm continuing to tighten, and as you can see, I've got just the slightest amount of play. So I'm going to put a little bit more torque on this, and then it's going to get to the point where I won't be able to move this. I won't feel any play at all in it. That's when I'm going to want to stop. I've got no play at all, and this thing spins freely. So now this is where things get interesting, okay? What I have to do is I have to tighten this enough so that my turning force to turn this is 12 inch-pounds for used bearings, which is what we have, or 15 inch-pounds for new bearings. So we're going with 12. So what we've got to do is we got to put a little bit more torque on this until we start to feel a little bit of drag. Obviously there's nothing here because it's just freewheels. Okay, so now I've crushed it enough so you can see I have no play, and if I try and turn it, it doesn't really spin. It turns freely, but it doesn't really spin. So here's a good time to start with our other setup, and we'll see what we have for a bearing preload. So what I need to do for this to happen is I need to support my bearing support so that I can turn my yoke like this. So what I'm trying to measure is how much tension it takes to rotate this on those bearings. Okay, so to measure that, I've got my 1 1/16 socket with a million little reducers to get me down to 1/4 inch. I have a 1/4 inch drive beam style torque wrench in inch-pounds. I mean, we're talking, it's not a lot of tension to do this. So I like this because it's inexpensive and it's kind of infallible. I mean, we're on 0 right now. We only need it to be on 12. So what we're going to do is we're going to put this right on here. We're going to go like this, and we're going to take a look and see how much tension we have on it when we go to turn it. So I'm on 0. Looks like I got about 8 inch-pounds. So now I'm going to flip it in the vise, I'm going to crush that sleeve a little bit more, and we're going to check it again. Okay, so I put a little bit more squeeze on it, and now I'm going to put my setup back on so I can watch this. Now there's a couple of things that happen is is there's a tension that it takes to get it to move. So in other words, if I grab this, it's got kind of like, you know, you have to break a little bit of resistance, but once you have it moves pretty easy. So what I do with my bar style thing is I get it moving, and then once it's moving, I just keep going, and I notice that I am pretty steady, and I'm right where I need to be. I'm right at 12. You know, with the bar style thing, you don't get a click, so I'm hovering right around 12, 11, 13, right in there. I feel pretty good. I'm feeling this. It feels good. It's not binding. I don't have any play. I feel really good about this. So now we're going to change this O-ring gasket. Okay, so here is our O-ring that we want to change. So I just kind of go in here with a little screwdriver, and I take this O-ring out of here. And this is the O-ring that I have. This is my new O-ring here. This is a traditionally round O-ring. This one's kind of interesting. It's flat, and it's got two tapered sides. So I believe that the idea with this is this tapered is going to make it so when we put it in this rear end housing, it slides in nice and easy. The first thing I'm going to want to do is clean out this groove. Make sure we don't have any crap in here all the way around. Get my rag right in that groove. Don't want anything in there. There you go. So now my groove is nice and clean. I'm going to take some nice clean oil. I'm going to put it on my nice dirty hands. And I'm going to oil up this seal so it is nice and flexible. Now, I'm just going to come down. I'm going to feel this seal and feel that flat side. And I'm just going to put it on here, boom, just like a rubber band, and there it is. I'll probably just put a little bit more oil on here like that, put a little on my finger, make sure that this housing has a little bit of lube, so when I slide these two pieces together, I have lubrication. Okay, the other thing we have is this. Now this is not a gasket that goes on here. This is an actual shim. This is what's setting the pinion depth. So we don't want to add any sealers to this or anything like that, and we do want to make sure that it is clean. Now we're going to drop that on here. Might as well put it on here, I guess. There we go. Now we have that on there. Now we can go ahead and we can slip this right in here. Here we go. There it is. Okay, so now, in the interest of making life easy, before I get this thing down home, I put all my bolts through my housing, through the shim, and into the housing, the carrier housing. Then I can give this a little wiggle and a tap, and it should go right into place. A couple of taps with my dead blow hammer here, and I can just snug up my bolts. These are 3/8 bolts, so 35 foot-pounds of torque is usually the norm. Do it in a crisscross pattern. Right now I'm just snugging up. Then I'll put the torque wrench to it, make sure that they're torqued. Then I know I have proper tension here. Okay, all right, so we got our bearing preload is all set. Our seal is all in, our pinion seal's in, our gasket surfaces are clean. I took a gasket and I already adhered it to the rear end housing. So basically I'm going to wipe this down. I'm going to paint it before I put it back in, just because I like my stuff to look nice. So I'm going to paint this and then we'll put it in. Okay, so here's my rear end housing. I cleaned it, I painted it, I'm all dialed in, everything looks great. My gasket surface is all clean on this side. Rear end housing is all been cleaned. I took and glued a gasket down on this housing with some high tack, and now I am going to transfer my pumpkin into my rear end and get my bolts on there and get this sealed up and done. Okay, so at this point I got my pumpkin popped in. I put all nice new hardware on here. I'm going to get all of these bolts snugged up, and then I'm going to torque them all to 35 foot-pounds, and we will be complete with the installation of the center section. All right, so now that our center section is all sealed, bolted up, what we're going to want to do is put our axles back in. But like I spoke of earlier, we're going to want to replace our axle seals. It's a very inexpensive way to save you a lot of hassle later on. If you put this all together and your axle seals leak, then you got to take it all back apart. And, you know, for a few dollars, it's definitely the way to go. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you how I remove the axle seal a nice, easy way. Okay, so here's our axle seal here in the housing. Okay, what we're going to want to do is we're going to use two tools. We're going to use our drill with a 1/8 drill bit, and we are going to use a slide hammer with a screw on the end of it. This is an auto body special for sure, and I'm going to show you exactly how I do this. So I feel on the back side of the seal to make sure I'm not going to touch anything that might be critical. I want to drill this 1/8 hole right through the wall of the seal right here like this. Now that I have that hole in the seal, what I am going to do is take my slide hammer and I'm going to screw into that hole until I know I'm in there nice and tight. Now my screw for my slide hammer is in the seal housing. Now I can just slowly but surely tap this out, and it pulls the seal out like this. And that's all there is to it. Okay, now that I have the seals out on both sides, something is really important. Seeing how I did drill that, I am going to want to make sure that the inside of this housing is nice and clean, and I don't have any of the filings from where I drilled my hole. So I'm going to clean this out really good. Okay, so now my housing is nice and clean. I've got my new seal, and this seal has this green coating on the outside, okay? That seals the outer ring of the seal to the housing. So when you remove this seal, the old one, you want to make sure that all that seal is out of there. So I just took a little emery paper and cleaned that out. I've got a seal driver here to put this seal in, and I am going to install this seal. I want this to go in as squarely as possible. Feel in the back side where the seal has to stop. There we go. Okay, so now our seal's in. I'm going to go ahead and pop the other side in. Then we'll be ready for some axles. Okay, so now with my seals in place, I'm going to take a little bit of my multi-purpose oil, and I am going to lubricate this seal so that when I slip that axle in, I'm not going up against a dry seal. Okay, so now we're all ready to put our axles in. I've taken and wiped down the entire axle along with the surface where the seal rides on it and where the bearing fits in. So what I'll do is I will insert my axle carefully not to hit the seal. Now I'm going to kind of support this and just slip it in here ever so slightly. Now, when it touches the spider gears in the rear end, you're going to have to find where the slots are. There's no specific spot that it has to be. It just has to be in the spline. So if you hit up against it and it won't go in, just turn it a little bit. To know if you're in that spider gear or not, just turn the axle and the yoke should turn, you know you're in. Then you can take your bearing plate, slip it over the bolts, and then this should slide right in there. You may have to give it a little tap to get it in, but then you should be all set. Okay, there we go. We turn freely. So now I've got my bearing home. I'm in. Now I can put my nuts on. Now, the thing of it is, is really, I only have one nut that I can just screw right on because I have my bracketry for my caliper that goes like this, if you remember before. So here is my caliper bracket. Here are my bolts for my axle on both sides. I'm going to tighten these down, and then we'll be ready to slip the rotor on and reassemble our brakes. So I've got my bolts snugged up. I have access to each bolt through this little window that's cut in the axle, so I will turn it. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to torque these bolts to 35 foot-pounds in a crisscross fashion so that I have nice even pressure on my bearing plate. So I just kind of crisscross back and forth. There's my 35 right there. 35 there. Okay, now I have my axle in there, it's positioned, it's tight, my caliper bracket's on. I'm going to button up the other side, then we'll come back, we'll put the rotors on and the brakes. So now I'm ready to put my rotors on, and the truck sat someplace that was rather damp, and the rotors kind of glazed over with a little rust. Took my dual action sander, cleaned those up, and I make sure that I have some never-sees on the backside of these so that they don't stick to the axle at a later date. So I'm going to just walk my rotor back on here. There we go. Alright, so now we're all set. I got the rotors on both sides. We're going to load the pads into the calipers and slide the calipers on, and we're almost done. Okay, so this brought up an interesting situation. If you can look inside of here, you'll see these slots. There's a deep slot right here that needs to be at 12 o'clock to index this tab on the pad. What happens is that turns, or it can turn if this becomes too loose, and that turning is what adjusts your emergency brake. So this is locked into the pad, and as you use your emergency brake, it creates a ratchet situation and it screws this piece out. Sometimes you have to screw it back in. Mine turned a little bit, and I had to use one of my tools to turn this to be in the right position. So I have this caliper tool here, and this is the piece that I use. That sets on top of that the puck for the caliper, and then this locates into it, and then you turn it, and you turn it and you relocate that piece. It's kind of for another video, but I just figured I'd give you a synopsis of it. So we're ready to go. I put one of my lug nuts on to hold this rotor flush and perpendicular on the axle. I've got my caliper just about ready. I'm going to load my pads into it. I'm going to take this pair of side cutters and I'm going to clip my mechanics wire because I've got a limited amount of hands to be able to do all this work. So I need to have kind of a economy of scale. Once I have this loaded in here, then my two bolts come in from the backside, which I have right here. So I'm going to take those and put those up on the frame like that. And you got to do this all while you're wearing a camera on your head. Make sure that you have that pin lined up inside this brake pad here. There you go. So now I got it in there. Alright, so once I have that thing through that back pad, I'm okay. Now, like this, get it through this one, right here, and then just kind of wiggle everything around, and you should be okay. There's quite a bit of tension on that spring that holds this on here. So I got my top bolt started. This one you can see really good. So I'm starting to come into the threads over here, and I want to make sure that this pin goes in this hole right here. And there's the tension from the spring clip on that inner brake pad that you're kind of fighting. but you should be able to screw that right in. See, now I'm right where I need to be. My pads aren't going to rattle, and I can turn these caliper bolts all the way in basically by hand. Like, they should turn freely. Okay, that's it. We'll tighten these up and we're good. Okay, now we have all of our brakes are assembled on both sides. Our rotors are on. Pretty much this whole thing is complete. We just have two things left. We're going to put some fluid in it, and we're going to put the drive shaft in it. But before I get into that, I just wanted to talk to you about this brake setup. This brake setup is made by a company called MBM. I will put a link to it in the description below. It's a really good setup. It's relatively cheap and easy to install, but I have a lot of people. I did a video on installing these brakes on a Chrysler 8 3/4 and on a Ford 9-inch, and I get a lot of questions about how I rigged up the emergency brake. And the emergency brake is very simple. It's just a matter of what your application is. So this particular one, what I did was I used Lokar's universal emergency brake kit, and they're mounted to the floor handle to apply the brake. Okay, in the Chrysler, I used Lokar's universal system, but then I used the original, it was 67 Charger. I used the original foot pedal, and I just tied into the front cable and used that. For this particular one, I am going to bring my small camera over, and I will show you the emergency brake cable setup from front to back. Okay, so this is what you get in the Lokar system. You get these cable housings, you get these adjustable ends, you get some bracketry. This end isn't terminated. It comes with where the wires slide through this brass block, and it's secured by these set screws. You cut your cable to length, and then it's got this universal end here that drops through a hole and comes through here, and there's your adjustment. So what I did was I made this setup here to go to my floor-mounted e-brake, and as you could see, my cables run back like this, and then this one here is running over to the passenger side. It comes over here to the passenger side. You can see, basically, it's right here. The end of it pops right onto this bracket. You got a spring, and there's your arm. When you pull on the brake, boom, it applies your emergency brake. Here is another view. This is the other side. Now this one over here, same deal. You've got the cable. It's got a swage on the end that I have a tool that I can put this on, but this actually comes on the kit, comes through here, and then I just mount it to the frame and follow it all the way back up to the front to my actual Lokar setup here. Now when I pull on the handle up there, this swings forward and pulls on these cables and applies the brakes. Pretty simple setup. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to top off my rear end with some gear lube. I have some Stay Lube gear lube. Okay, so here's the Stay Lube gear oil. Obviously, you can read the front of it. It says SAE 85W140 Hypoid Limited Slip. Okay, it's API GL5. Now, you come over here to our rear axle housing, and right here, what you're going to see is a pipe plug with a square end. A 3/8 ratchet or a 3/8 extension will go right in there, turn it counterclockwise, and then you put your fluid in here. You are going to fill this until the fluid is at the bottom of this hole. So in other words, fill it until it starts to leak out, then put your plug in. So we're going to have at it. Okay, so here we are. I've used my suction gun here and put my gear oil in there. Now, what you see here right now is I'm at the bottom of that hole. I'm getting a little drizzle coming out of there. That means I'm full. I'm going to put my plug in, and my rear end is good to go. Okay, so now we have oil in the rear end. The only thing we have left is a drive shaft. I get the drive shaft out. I wiped it all down, cleaned it all up. I took a little bit of emery paper, I cleaned up the yoke where it goes into the transmission, and I put a little oil in there, a little oil on the outside of that yoke to lubricate the seal on the back of the transmission. So now we're going to pop it in. Okay, so here's where our yoke goes in the back of the transmission. There's the seal. I got this thing all wiped down, ready to go. Here's our yoke on the rear end. We're going to slide our drive shaft in here, pop our U-joints in here, put our U-bolts on, and we'll be good to go. So I'm going to take these U-bolts and my washers, my lock washers and my nuts, and get them in a location where I will be able to get a hold of them when the time arises. Nothing will hold it except for, there you go. Okay, now as you can see, my U-joint's going in. I want to make sure that these two caps are caught. I don't want to let go of this until I at least have this secure, because I don't want it to fall on the floor and have the caps come off of the U-joints and have needle bearings everywhere. Not fun times. So now we're just going to work on getting these all tightened up, and then our drive shaft will be in. I'll probably grease my U-joints just for good measure. Tighten these nice and even on both sides. You can tell that we're in park because the drive shaft is not turning, so that's good. Because we do have the brand new transmission in this truck. I like to use a wrench for a lot of things because it allows me to really feel how much torque I'm putting on things. Alright, there we go. Now our drive shaft's all set. Okay, so now we've got our drive shaft in. What I did was I made sure my emergency brakes were adjusted. I pumped up my brakes to get my calipers out first. Then I adjusted my emergency brake. I've got brakes, I've got emergency brake. They apply, they release, we're good to go. So really at this point, it's just going to be put the rims and tires on the back of it. Torque it to 100 foot-pounds is what I put on my lug nuts. Make sure that they're on there square. We don't warp anything or strip anything. And at that point, this entire project is done. So I'm going to bring the small camera over and walk you from stem to stern so you can see what it looks like now. Okay, so as you can see, here's our brakes and all of our bolts for our axle flange is all tight. Our calipers are all positioned like they should be. Same with this one that's over here. I got this light that kind of gives you some glare so you can see that pretty good right there. You come around here, my flange is all sealed where my pumpkin goes on to the banjo. My pinion housing is also sealed. I have no leaks. My pinion seal's fine. This turns nice and easy. I've greased my U-joints, and my U-joint bolts are tight. And up here, where I go into the rear end, I cleaned out with emery, and I had put a little oil on here just to lubricate the seal. And as you can see, this looks a heck of a lot better than it did when we started. Well, all right, folks, that concludes our resealing of the Ford 9-inch. Now you can check out some of my other videos that I use this truck on. I'll put a link up here. I just did a TCI transmission in this truck. I've done a Holley sniper system on this truck. It's got a Paxton supercharger. There's all kinds of videos of it. There's all kinds of videos of how to do all kinds of automotive things, including auto body and painting. So please like and subscribe and support the channel. If you need to purchase anything, there's links for almost everything that I used below. Please use my links. It helps me out. And thank you for tuning in, and good luck on your project.